academy, and the first thing they do is send us off to university for 6 months. Couldn't believe it. Here I was again. But the time I spent at uni, whilst I don't have any formal qualifications, I've got a half of an arts degree and a half of a business degree. So to me, that makes a degree. But somehow they don't recognise that. I'm not sure what that's about. But the time I spent at university was actually fantastic. I didn't necessarily really appreciate what I learned there until much later on. And there was my favourite topic was social ethics and the justice system, and I thought, this is ridiculous, I don't need to be taught about ethics, but it's actually something that in business has stood me in very good stead, and something that I appreciated. From the police academy, I graduated. Now, I graduated and I was about 18 and a half, I guess. So now I think I was a reasonably mature 18-year-old, because having quite young parents, I started partying at about 1. And in between spending time with my grandmother and going to some wild parties, I spent most of my time around adults, because my parents' friends didn't really have children at that age, because they used contraception, obviously. So I spent a lot of time around adults. So I think that as a policeman I was reasonably mature, but nonetheless I was wearing a gun, handcuffs, carrying a baton, driving police cars at 220 kilometres an hour down the wrong way of a freeway, chasing some lunatic who was high on drugs, trying to outrun us. So it was an interesting experience, and I got to do a number of things that most, I guess, normal people wouldn't get to do. And also was my earliest teachings of negotiation, turning up to domestic violence disputes, serving warrants on convicted attempted murderers and murderers. That was always interesting. And sometimes the negotiation wasn't always verbal, sometimes it got physical, but the one thing you did learn, particularly with dealing with drunks, was that you were always best to talk your way out of a situation. And sometimes that required, as a policeman, to be fairly humble. Sometimes when we were working in a place called Fortitude Valley, which is, I guess, is the equivalent of King's Cross in Brisbane. It's Brisbane style, but nonetheless it's the equivalent. We would often go out without guns, without handcuffs, without batons, and that was the best way to negotiate with the locals, because they could see that you had some respect for them and that you didn't need to fall on your force, and that it was about you and them. And more often than not, that would be the best way to negotiate out of that outcome. Anyway, that's enough about policing. A couple of years after that, it wasn't for me. It was very much a numbers game. You were a number. It was quite restrictive, and it wasn't really the place I wanted to be. So I guess I did what most teenagers do, or what most uni students do. I went off wandering a little bit. I spent some time doing all sorts of things. One of my jobs was repairing wheelie bins. That was fascinating. I spent some time on a farm in Tasmania running cattle, which from a surfer from Sydney was interesting as well, and doing some work in B&Bs, that sort of thing that most people do. I spent some time driving a van delivering electrical goods, and then I spent some time selling saucepans. Now, saucepans, you might say, that's an interesting thing. I don't know if any of you have heard of a thing called Renaware. You have? Yep. Well, saucepans that back 12 years ago or so cost about $2,500. So they were expensive. But they were good. They were great quality, but they were expensive. And I joined on the promises of travel. There was a retainer. That was nice. And I could go off and travel essentially around the eastern seaboard. So to me, it was backpacking with a wage. I thought, this will be good. So I went and did that, and had moderate success, I guess, to start with, because I thought I'd do it my way. I was an ex-policeman, I knew boats, I'll be right, off I went. Had moderate success, and then they said, listen, you really need to follow this system. So they put me on the system, and I think that generally I was closing 7 out of 10 sales, which is probably as good as most people were doing. However, unfortunately, I realised that most of the people that we were seeing, how we would get leads is that we would go to local fairs and local festivals in the towns, and we would generate leads that way primarily. And what I realised is that most of the people that we were selling saucepans to really shouldn't have been buying saucepans, for 2 reasons. First, they couldn't afford it. That was okay. We had a finance plan. We could finance them into their saucepans. And secondly, because they're clearly a depreciating asset. I don't know how much those Renaware saucepans are worth. Interestingly, they're probably worth close to about what they paid, but I don't know that inflation's had much of an impact on them. So clearly it went against my grain. But what it did teach me was about demonstrations and about about following a process and about, I guess in some respects, human emotion and how you could walk them through the process. Now, it wasn't necessarily something I was particularly proud of, selling saucepans, and I don't mean because I was embarrassed to say selling saucepans. In fact, it's a great story to tell now. I love it. But it was selling to people that really shouldn't have been buying them, and ultimately that turned me away, and I went on to find a job in my passion, which was property. Now, as I'm overlaying professionally here, I'm buying some property in the background, so I'll go back and cover that in a minute, and we'll talk through some practical examples, and I'll try and familiarise you with where I was at the time. So my first job in property was working for a developer in southeast Queensland. He was selling land on the fringes, so it was a bit like going back to Sydney, really, with what Mum and Dad did. They were acreage lots, and the developer was pretty smart. He had his own real estate agency set up, and he had them set up in various areas, and they worked on what was called the advertiser system. So I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with the advertiser system. A lot of the time, when I tell you this story, I'm sure that you'll have times with it, but if you read the classifieds of most metropolitan papers, you'll see rural property listed, and you'll read an ad that says something like small weekender, used cabin, rainforest, trickling creek, 5 acres, $40,000. Generally, it'll be half the price of everything else that's in the area. Sounds great. Make a call. So you'd call me. I'd get your name and details. And my objective was to get you into the office, to get you into the car, and essentially take you on what they called a run. So we would run you around an area. Again, it was a demonstration type method. Specifically, we'd take you to the first site. The problem with the first site was that generally it had a mine shaft under it. It flooded, had power lines over it, or was about to have a train line put in next to it. So there was clearly something wrong with the property. We would start at that first place. We would then take you directly next to an enormously expensive house that you clearly couldn't afford, because we would have qualified you and got an idea of what you were able to afford. We would then take you to a couple of other places, slowly creeping out to the fringes, and magically end up in this beautiful estate that just seemed like the perfect option. So again, we had reasonably good success with that, but at the end of the day, really the ethics of the situation, maybe going back to uni, I'm not sure, but the ethics of the situation wasn't really me. But again, I learned a hell of a lot. And through those two processes, I learnt about sales and about, as I say, human emotion, but I also came across self-development, and that is the single biggest thing that those jobs did for me. The first tape I think I ever got was a pirated copy of Tom Hopkins' 21 Closing Techniques. I might have to send those dollars to Tom, I think. And then Anthony Robbins tapes and those sorts of things. And really that started a self-development path for me that continues to today. In fact, I feel like I've sort of jumped across the divide today, but I'm absolutely a person who loves sitting in the audience and listening to what other people have got to say. And I'm an avid reader of books, biographies. My car has always got some type of CD or tape or something in there. In fact, my friends always poke fun at me at how I never have the radio on. They jump in and there's someone talking about something to do with business or work or something. And I love that they make fun of that. It's great. I think I've spent probably close to $100,000 on that sort of material. And if you come to my house, my spare room is absolutely chock-a-block full of it. If you can take somebody's life and condense it into 10 minutes, an hour or 2 hours, and take 3 things out of that presentation, then I think that whatever that money costs is well worth it. This isn't a sell on self-development. I'm just honestly telling you about my own personal views on it. After I finished with the property thing, I read a little ad in the classifieds for a job on the Sunshine Coast, and I spent some time surfing on the Sunshine Coast when I was at Bribie. It's just north of Bribie, really. When you're at Bribie, you say you're the start of the Sunshine Coast. When you're on the Sunshine Coast, you say Bribie is the start of Brisbane. That's sort of how it works. No one really wants Bribie. So there was this little ad. I didn't really know what the job was for, but it mentioned property. That was good enough for me, and it was on the Sunshine Coast. So I went to this interview, and they were really looking for sort of a 19-year-old apprentice. It was a small company. There were 3 directors, 1 secretary, and they were looking for someone else. I struck off quite a good relationship in the interview with one of the directors, to the point where he offered me a job anyway, and I accepted. And I can remember turning up on the first day. I didn't really know what the job was. Again, I knew it was property. I liked them. I knew that it was on the Sunshine Coast, but I turned up and I didn't really know what it was. Now, it turned out that it was as a commercial agent. And up until that point, I didn't really realise commercial property existed. Now, it might sound a little silly. It certainly does to me now, but I guess I'd been to shops all my life, like everybody. I'd been past offices, I'd been through shopping centres, I'd probably even been through the odd industrial estate with my father. But really, I didn't know that asset class existed. And I guess that was a good lesson at the time on reflection, because there are often things that are existing out there that people are using successfully and making money on, making a lifestyle from, whatever, that you don't often realise are actually there. And it's not until sometimes someone points it out to you that you go, oh yeah, that's right, of course. So I spent the next essentially 5 years in commercial agency. Those 3 directors that I mentioned became 2 became 1. Ultimately I bought the last one out. I essentially closed the business down straight away, merged it in with another business, which was called First Pacific Davies. They were a branch of a Brisbane agency. That agency then became FPD Savills, and that business is now called Savills. So for those of you that have some dealings in commercial property, Savills are one of the largest commercial agents in the world now. I didn't do that, we just sold off to them. But the partner who I left behind when I left the agency, he's only just recently sold out to Savills and is retained there now as a consultant. I spent, as I say, 5 years in commercial agency. I then made the jump across to development. So I'm going to cover both of those roles in a little more detail as we go through the presentation, rather than boring you now with my entire life story. But those particular 2 jobs have moulded a number of the property decisions that I've made over time, and certainly no doubt helped me with my experience and hopefully a lot of the information which I can give you both this morning and particularly this afternoon. The plan this afternoon is to really go into the nitty-gritty of how you go about a commercial or a development transaction. So I'm going to talk you through how you find them to start with. For those of you that have absolutely no concept like I didn't know commercial property existed, I'm going to start from where you find out about it, going through the feasibility studies, etc, etc, etc. Okay, first property. I'm winding back now. I was in the police academy. I think that my wage was about $300 a week or something like that. It was fairly ordinary. But when I was growing up in Bribie, a friend of mine, his parents had a caravan at Coolum. It was a great spot. I had a good holiday there one time, 2 weeks. Had great surf. It was beautiful, better than the surf we had at Bribie. So I had a fascination for Coolum, and I was just literally reading the paper one weekend and came across this little ad. It was a government land sale. Now, they don't really do those in Queensland too much anymore. They used to do them quite a lot again because the area was growing. And I think the government decided that private developers were better to be developing land instead of the government, so they've stopped that now. But at the time, the block of land was 32,500. We'd take a few of those now, wouldn't we? And they offered me government terms. So it was at a land auction. There was, I think from memory, about 50 odd lots that were auctioned that day. So here's this fresh-faced 17-year-old turning up to bid. I think people thought I was there to pass out water. It was a 10% deposit that you had to put down. There was no loan, so it was a little different than necessarily the way that things work now, but nonetheless that was the terms that were available at the time. So 10% deposit down, which was obviously 32.5 plus some stamp duty and those sorts of things. And then the next payment wasn't required to be made for 1 year. Now the good part about that for me was that I couldn't actually afford the payments, because by the time I took my board into account, my food, of course, and my drinking money, I was at the police academy after all, I was about $20 over budget, and I think that allowed about $20 worth of drinking money. So I really couldn't actually afford this. So having not to pay for a year, I think that from memory it transacted in about June, so I had until June the next year. So I decided that if I put a little bit of money aside, maybe reducing the drinking, I'm not sure, something. And when I graduated at the end of the year, I would go on to a full wage. I would then be able to put some money aside and make this first payment. So that all sounded good at the time, and off I went. And then at the end of the year, I think I started to get a bit panicked about the ability to pay off this block of land that I'd bought, or make the first payment, I should say. So I spoke to a local agent, and he went and secured an offer from the government. How about that? I bought it off the government, 32.5, and they've offered me 47.5. It's a good system.